morning. Welcome to the 41st Annual International MUFON Symposium. Our first speaker this morning truly needs no introduction in the field of ufology. Well known for his Roswell research, Stanton Friedman, nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman, has authored 5 books. His newest, co-authored with Kathleen Martin, is Science Was Wrong. Stan was recently named in Roswell, New Mexico by, I believe, the museum, if I have that correct, as part of the Roswell Hall of Fame. Congratulations to Stan on that achievement. And with that being said, I like to keep it short because Stan has a lot of excellent information to say. Here to talk about Stephen Hawking, SETI, and science, let me welcome to the stage nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman.
Thanks, John. I'm curious about this talk too, since I've never given it before. And somebody showed me an article which I missed somehow in the MUFON Journal, taking me to task for giving the SETI guys a hard time. I don't think I've given them a hard enough time, frankly. The focus of today is that one of the major reasons that ufology hasn't been properly recognized by the scientific and journalistic community have been the staunch efforts of the astronomical community coupled with the SETI community to say there's life out there, but they ain't coming here. And therefore this UFO stuff is nonsense. They've been saying that for a long time. They won't look at the UFO evidence, but they have their own agenda to point out to us. They don't often tell you the underlying assumptions. This should not be surprising. In the newest book that John mentioned, we have a whole chapter on space, aviation. There are 14 chapters. Kathleen and I each did 7. And the point is that smart people have been saying basically stupid things for a long time. And astronomers have taken the lead. And, you know, I'll let a psychologist or a psychiatrist figure out why. The resistance to the new, the different. But before I get into that, let me give my usual two-minute introduction to where I stand so there'll be no question about the position that I hold. After 52 years of study and investigation, I'm convinced that the evidence is overwhelming that Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. I don't care about them. Most isotopes aren't fissionable. So what? You want to build a reactor, use the one that is. Secondly, we're dealing with a cosmic Watergate, meaning some few people within governments around the world have known since at least July 1947, when bodies and vehicles were recovered in New Mexico, that indeed some UFOs are alien spacecraft. They didn't say the government knows, some few people within government. The third conclusion is, despite the rantings of the noisy negativists, that there are no good arguments against the first two. Not that people haven't tried, but none of them stand up when compared to the evidence. And finally, fourth, we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. I'm not a mollycoddler. I don't walk gently into that big night. Now, you put all that together, we're talking about the biggest story. I say millennium because if I said 2, then I'd get into religious arguments, and I don't want to get into those, not here now. Okay. Now, one would think, therefore, that people interested in outer space would be in the forefront of those looking at the UFO evidence. And at one time, people like Dr. J. Allen Hynek, an astronomer after all, Air Force consultant on Project Blue Book for over 20 years, author of an excellent book, The UFO Experience. You'd think that astronomers today would naturally refer you to Allen's book. No such luck. Instead, we get told that there is no evidence that Earth is being visited. Now, do they tell you this and say, look, I've looked at all these scientific studies, there's nothing to them? No, they'll tell you there are no scientific studies. Very strange. In my usual lectures, I talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies. When Dr. Seth Shostak attended my lecture on the Queen Elizabeth II, that was a sort of weird trip. We each gave 3 lectures. What else are you going to do in the North Atlantic but listen to a lecture on space or UFOs? After each major study, I asked how many people here have read this. He didn't raise his hand any times. And yet the byword is there is no evidence for UFOs. Now, let's look at the assumptions of the astronomical community. 1, there is alien life in outer space. I'm not going to argue with that. 2, ain't nobody coming here. If they were, they'd have sent us a signal. We haven't detected any signals from anybody out there, but just wait, it'll happen. That's assuming that aliens out there are using technology compatible with our 2010 radio technology. Well, I don't know about you people, but I don't use the slide rule anymore. I said that to a couple of classes up in Michigan, and I was saying how much technology has changed in the last 50 or so years, and I said, you know, when I started working in industry, I was using a slide rule, and I looked around, no reaction at all. I said, do any of you know what a slide rule is? Not one. Not one. And that's less than 50 years. The point is that times change, technology changes. And if we don't recognize that, we're losing out here. So I want to go over, we have a strange situation. This year, the press has been kinder to the idea of aliens than in many, many years. Oh, not UFOs, it's not the same thing. But there have been respectable scientists talking about life in outer space. When Stephen Hawking says something, people listen, even though what he said wasn't too bright, frankly. And I'll go into specifics in a minute. And I know some people don't like my saying that SETI really stands for silly effort to investigate. SETI, in case you didn't notice that. Well, let's look at the assumptions. Life out there, nobody coming here, no evidence for UFOs, interstellar travel is out of the question. They will send us signals. And if they haven't sent us a signal, they certainly haven't come here. Now, if you can figure that one out, you're a better man than I am, Gunga Din. I'll throw in the remark now, it should come when I'm talking about Stephen Hawking, but did any of you ever hear about Columbus sending a smoke signal to the natives in the New World before he took off? I don't think so. Now, you will hear estimates of how many civilizations there are using the famed Drake equation. Frank Drake, 50 years ago, did the first search for signals from civilizations in outer space. Listened to 2 stars, didn't hear anything. Set up an equation that's supposed to give us the probability or determine how many civilizations there are in our galaxy. Now, we use the term equation as if it were a scientific statement, but of course we don't know what numbers to fill in. It's dartboard physics. You pick a number, we'll see how it comes out. For example, what's the lifetime of a civilization? We don't have any data on the answer to that question. We know how long we've been around, which isn't very long. Now remember, it is also assumed that there is no colonization and no migration. Even though I would expect that most of you are here because your ancestors, not too many generations ago, colonized, migrated, crash landed. That's the major means for people moving about. But you see, if you say the first civilization lasts 10,000 years, but what if it spun off a colony and that lasts 10,000 years, and it spun off a colony that lasts 10,000 years, right on down the line? So what's the lifetime of a civilization? Is it the sum of all those terms? We don't know. Now, they also assume that radio is the ultimate means of communication. Radio is similar to what we use now. And, think about that for a while, and then tell me that you're convinced that 100 years from now, our techniques will be the same. Look what's happened in the world of computers, communication systems, all the rest. Everything has changed, right on down the line. So, we need to bear in mind the stuff that these guys brush aside. And I always get asked, well, why would they not take a scientific approach to this problem? Simple statement. If aliens are visiting, who needs SETI? Learn sign language. Be more useful, maybe. They'd be out of a job. It's like those guys pushing climate change. If man isn't responsible, what's the point? Spend a couple $100 billion. That's in the new book. I shouldn't get off on that. Okay, now, astronomy has a long history of saying dumb things from smart people. This is Dr. Simon Newcomb, was the outstanding American astronomer of the 19th century. He was so important that when he died in about 1909, the President of the United States attended his funeral. Great prestige. And he was born in Canada, too, so I should be proud of that. I'm a dual citizen. I can complain about both governments, Here is something he said. The demonstration that no possible combination of known substances, known forms of machinery, and known forms of force can be united in a practical machine by which man shall fly long distances through the air seems to this writer as complete as it is possible for the demonstration of any physical fact to be. Now, the interesting thing is that he said this 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. Now, what did Dr. Newcomb know about flight? Nothing. Oh, he knew birds fly, but beyond that. You notice that word known in there. It's been one of my mantras for a long time that technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. A laser isn't just a better light bulb. I worked on nuclear rockets. They're not just better chemical rockets, entirely different physics. Now, the Wright brothers were two bicycle mechanics, but they ran wind tunnel tests to verify the effects of speed on lift and drag and things like that, shape of the craft, the curves, all kinds of things. And they looked at the previous literature. That's one of the places where the SETI guys go totally astray. You won't find references to the UFO literature. So he's just one example, but 2 months. Now, incidentally, the Wright brothers a couple years later got a bonus. Their first flight was in 1903, December. They got a government contract. They were turned down a couple of times because of people like Dr. Newcomb. They got a bonus of $5,000 for making a machine that would go faster than 40 miles an hour. That was the threshold, 40. They got 47 miles an hour. We've come a long way, baby, in 100 years. But you notice that today's airplanes don't look much like the Wright brothers' first plane. Progress comes from doing things differently. The whole flight that first flight was 112 feet long, would fit inside a 747. Dr. Newcomb didn't know what he was talking about, even though he said it so strongly, clearly, unambiguously. He was wrong. British Astronomer Royal Here's another great comment. This was in 1956. He was asked about space travel. I don't know why, but he was asked about it. He told Time magazine, "It is utter bilge. I don't think anybody will ever put up enough money to do such a thing. What good would it do us? If we spent the same amount of money on preparing first-class astronomical equipment, we would learn much more about the universe. It is all rather rot." First Sputnik a year later, man on the moon 13 years later. And you know what's really crazy is the field of science that has benefited most by far from the space program has been astronomy. Of course, maybe he wasn't happy about the thought that maybe our long cherished truths would turn out to be false. Do you know that we were told a long time ago by astronomers that we would never be able to know what the composition of the stars was? That Mars has always been dry? That Venus was a tropical paradise, if you like, 600 degree sulfuric acid atmosphere? Man would never go anywhere away from the Earth, couldn't handle the meteors, a whole long list of excuses. And astronomy was wrong. One of my favorite wrongnesses, if I can make up a word, was Dr. Campbell, a Canadian astronomer. 1941, did a study of getting a man to the moon and back. There was a lot of science fiction being written at that time about doing that. And he said, let's do a scientific calculation. So the question he asked was, a very reasonable one, how big would the rocket have to be? Pages of equations, published paper. It's referenced in my paper. And I do recommend people buy the proceedings, because then you'll get something I wrote, not necessarily something I'm saying. He calculated the required initial launch weight for a rocket able to get a man to the moon and back would be 1 million tons. Even for me, that's too darn big. But less than 30 years later, we got 3 guys to the moon and back, still with the dumb old chemical rocket. His initial launch weight was 3,000 tons. He was off by a factor of 300 million. Not 3, not 30, not 3,000, 300 million. Why? A, he hadn't consulted the previous literature, scientific literature. B, he made every possible stupid assumption about how you'd go about it. Single-stage rocket launched directly up, limit of 1g acceleration. You'd have to provide all the energy. The only way you could slow down when coming back would be to use a retro rocket. Of course, you've got to take that off the Earth, slow it down at the moon, lift it off from the moon, slow it down back here. Now, some people, he just said the assumption was that the rocket had to provide all the energy. Of course, where else would you get the energy? Mother Nature, folks. Cosmic freeloading. Smart engineers have figured out a long time ago how to use the gravitational field of the Earth. We're rotating at the equator, so you launch to the east. That's 3,000 miles an hour. You have a launch window. So you launch at the right time so that the moon will come along, and it's very reliable in its path around the Earth, and pull you in. Why should you provide all the energy? You can get it for free. Coming back, don't you have to slow down? Well, you better. You're going 25,000 miles an hour, but why not use the atmosphere? It's free. You got to be smart. Get the angle right. Remember Apollo 13? Too steep and you dig a hole in the ground, and too shallow and it's bye-bye Earth. But it's an important illustration that you can't just start with basic science and I'll do a scientific calculation and come up with meaningful results, because it doesn't work that way. All our deep space probes have done cosmic freeloading. The Cassini spacecraft is still running around Saturn, getting some very exciting and interesting results. We sent it closer to the sun to go around Venus to get a free kick. So it would come past the Earth and get another free kick, and go past Jupiter and get another free kick. Why should you pay when you can get a freebie? Astronomers don't seem to understand that. So we have a long history of rotten pronouncements from on high that are totally wrong and unscientific and irrational. And they've stood in the way of making progress, because the biggest argument against UFOs, you can't get here from there. Not on a bicycle. There are other ways. That's a nifty H-bomb explosion. One of the things that we tend to forget is every civilization in the neighborhood that's at least as advanced as we are, which probably means most, will figure out the answer to the important question, how does our star produce its energy? And then can we do it? We figured that out in 1938, nuclear fusion. Theoretically, that would do the job. In 1952, we put it to the test. We exploded our first H-bomb. Was that a little more energy per pound than a standard bomb? A lot. A great deal. Enormous amount more. 10 million tons of TNT equivalent energy release. 10 million tons, a 3-mile wide fireball. A big bomb during World War II was a 10-ton blockbuster. We're talking, we Earthlings have exploded a number of controlled fusion devices. Russians' biggest was 60 million tons of TNT equivalent. And I bring this up, not for a political statement, although it probably should be, but to recognize that we can use the energy of nuclear fusion to go to the stars. I worked on a study of that, hate to admit it, 39 years ago, by an outstanding physicist, under his direction anyway. If you use the right stuff in the right way and kick particles out the back end of the rocket that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in a dumb old chemical rocket. 10 million times. Yeah, but it would take too long to get there, Stan. I've asked this question in seminars. Every once in a while a student will tell me, hey, the professor's going to show you're an idiot, before I do my lecture that night, you know. So I make sure I talk about things that I know the professors know nothing about, and it's not hard to find. But then I ask a couple of sneaky questions. What's the numerical value of 1G? 9.8 meters per second squared. I say, yes, that's true. How do you relate that to a Corvette? You'd think I was talking Swahili. They haven't the faintest idea. Well, if you use sensible units like 21 miles per hour per second, that's 1G. You got a hot car and you could go 0 to 63 miles an hour in 3 seconds, you're pulling 1G, and that's a hot car too. And I ask them, what's the speed of light numerically? 300,000 kilometers per second. I say, okay, put it in units we all understand. It's 670 million miles an hour. Okay, now the question is, how long does it take at 1G to get to the speed of light? It's a multiple choice question, gentlemen. 1,000 years, 100 years, 10 years, or 1. You'd be surprised how many say 1,000 or 100 or 10. The answer is 1. These guys aren't connected to the real world. Yeah, but Stan, you can't go fast in the speed of light. It means you want to go to your favorite place, Zeta Reticuli, 39 light years away, 39 light years out, 39 back. That's a pretty long trip for a guy, isn't it? Well, I said, how about the other half of Einstein? Time slows down for things moving that fast. At 99.99% of the speed of light, you can do it in 6 months pilot time. They never talk about this. And incidentally, you can use stars to give you freebies too. Find a convenient black hole, don't get too close. And boy, can you get one heck of an acceleration out of it. There's a professor from Arizona, Paul Davies. He's written a book, The Eerie Silence. He was born in England, he's worked in Australia, he's written 25 books. He's the new Carl Sagan. He's 12 years younger than Carl and I. Well, he's not here, but I am. Carl and I were the same age. And you may have seen him on various television programs. And he said a lot of interesting things. And I did a review of his book that was in the MUFON Journal. I offered to debate him. I sent a copy of my column to Coast to Coast. They sent it to him. He didn't want any part in debating me. I'll let you decide why. Here's a quote. This got a lot of attention, this book, this year. We need to give up the notion that ET is sending us some sort of customized message, and cosmologists and astrobiologists now at Arizona State take a new approach. And I agree with him, he's right. But what he wants to do is look for strange bacteria that may have originated someplace else. That's a novel approach for an astronomer. Look for the bugs. Now, I like this one. As science, this is from Paul, expands its knowledge of the universe, the probability of Earth-like planets out there increases every year. And thus the chance of intelligent life existing in space is at a point where it must be taken seriously by scientists. So as we learn more, that changes whether or not there is life out there. How do we do that? It's there or it isn't there. Whether we know anything about it or not is totally irrelevant. It's mind-boggling. Now, he talks a bit about UFOs and gets it all wrong. He said the purpose of he met Alan Hynek, made him sound like a nice gentleman, which he was. He talks about, he has two references, one to a book by a man named Bennett, who lives around here, as a matter of fact, who doesn't have any references in his book to any of the large-scale scientific studies. The other is the Condon report. He incorrectly states that Condon concluded that about 90% of the Blue Book sightings could be explained as normal phenomena, while the remaining 10% didn't contain enough of scientific value or of defense significance to warrant Blue Book's continuation. It was not Condon's job to look at the Blue Book sightings, and he didn't. If we look at the data in his report, well, I'll save that for a minute. Davies has gone on. This is about Hynek, really. He was interested, but he didn't like what he heard about what aliens were doing. Quote, the banality of the aliens' putative agenda, which seemed to consist of grubbing around in fields and meadows, chasing cows or aircraft or cars like bored teenagers, and abducting humans for Nazi-style experiments. Not what one would expect of cosmic superminds. Most of you know a lot about ufology. Is that your picture of what aliens are doing? It sure as heck isn't mine. But then, of course, he doesn't refer to any of the studies of what aliens have been observed to do. And I should quote, incidentally, that the UFO subcommittee of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics looked at the Condon report and concluded that one could come to the opposite conclusions from Dr. Condon. Any phenomena with 30% unexplainable is certainly worthy of further interest, scientific interest. They recommended more work be done. 30%. This sort of sums it up. The upshot is that traditional SETI probing the skies with radio telescopes looking for a message from the aliens may well be a good idea, but we are doing it a few millennia too soon. The only let out is if an alien presence is located much closer, within 50 light years. That would be amazing, but who knows? However, SETI astronomers have looked at every candidate star system out to that distance and drawn a blank. We know what systems they're using. We know that they're trying to send signals to us, so if we're not getting any, there aren't any out there sending. What is the basis for this? Wishful thinking, arrogance, egotism. We're so important that if there were anybody there, he'd certainly send us a message using our technology, basically. I find this quite extraordinary. Certainly unscientific. There's Frank Drake with the Drake equation. And Frank has conceded, there was a big conference in London at the beginning of the year, which got a lot of attention because very prominent people like Frank made comments. He is now saying that he expects there are at least 10,000 civilizations in the galaxy. 10,000 capable of sending signals to us. That sounds like a lot until you realize there's over 100 billion stars in the galaxy. That means only 1 in 10 million has a civilization, a planet with a civilization able to send stars to us. That means within 1,000 light years, assuming uniform distribution, there might be 2, us and somebody else. Pretty barren out there, folks. Ain't nobody there. Of course, there is no colonization, no migration, and no lip service paid to something that every advanced civilization is going to be concerned about. What if a catastrophe occurs and we got to move on? Whether it's a nuclear war, supernova, a meteor beats the heck out of us, all kinds of things. Everybody is going to look for, where do we go from here, and when do we do it, and how do we do it? So I think he vastly underestimates, but you see, the smaller that number is, the longer we're going to have to wait until we get a signal. Boy, talk about job security. Keep waiting, folks. My grandson will be listening too, My great-grandson, I have one of those. Frank's a nice guy. Don't misunderstand me. But these guys are totally unwilling to look at the evidence that somebody's coming here. There's Carl. Carl and I were classmates for 3 years at the University of Chicago. We went in different directions, you might say. He didn't go to the moon, that's not where he is in this picture. And I give Carl credit for doing more than anybody else to get people interested in the notion of extraterrestrial intelligence. Because back when he started making those noises, we didn't even know there were other planets outside our solar system. That's how smart we were. We knew they thought that the process that produces planets is 2 stars coming sort of close and ripping out parts of one, and that makes the planets. Nobody thinks that anymore. And now we found, I don't know what the latest number is as of yesterday, it was 460 exoplanets not very long ago. And we're just beginning to look. They're all over the place out there. We're having trouble finding Earth-sized ones because our techniques are still in the beginning stages. And last time I visited Carl, I was at his house before I was speaking at Cornell. We had a very pleasant conversation. Like I say, we're the same age. We grew up in adjacent towns in New Jersey. We agreed that there were things under security that he couldn't talk about. One of the things he said was that, look, the essence of science is reproducibility. And I sent him a long letter disagreeing with that after I got home. There are 4 kinds of science, just to go over that very quickly. When you control everything, you set up the experiment, you decide what equipment to use, you do your experiment, you write it up, submit it, it gets published, somebody else does the same thing. Yeah, reproducibility, that's great. But there are science that can be done when you can't control all the variables. Say, study eclipses. If I tell you, that sometimes the moon comes between the Earth and the sun, you say, you're crazy, man. I'll be there at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning with a camera and you show me. Well, it's not within my control. I can predict when it will happen, but I can't control it. And if the weather is bad, tough luck. There's a third kind. I can't predict, I can't control, but I can be ready to make measurements. I can have seismographs set up so when an earthquake occurs, I can't make one for you tomorrow morning. But when one does occur, I can get measurements from a bunch of different instruments. At Chicago, we had a block of nuclear emulsion tied to a balloon. And when we found out there was this big solar storm going on, because the gamma rays get here quickly, the particles don't, somebody would rush out to Stagg Field, inflate the balloon, send it up with the emulsion, and we'd recover it, we hoped, and we'd find out what kind of particles had come from the sun. Can't predict, can't control, can make observations. But then there's a 4th kind of science, and that's what we're concerned with, involving intelligence. Bank robberies, rapes, automobile accidents, airplane crashes. I can guarantee you more than 30,000 Americans will die in automobile accidents in the next 12 months. I can't say who or where or when or how, But I can use the methods of science to find out, the alcohol level in the driver's blood, how good the brakes were, what the weather conditions were, how long the skid marks are, and a whole bunch of other things. The methods of science, it's a way of problem solving. So we can do that with UFOs. People don't like eyewitness testimony? Tough. That's what our court systems are based on. Rarely does DNA enter into the picture. You have a defense attorney and a prosecuting attorney, and you try to figure out where the truth is and what people are telling you. Is it 100% certain? Of course not. So what? Best baseball players get paid a ton of money for getting a hit 1/3 of the time. Would you say they're lousy baseball players because 2/3 of the time they didn't get a hit? That's ridiculous. So Carl deserves credit. He turned people off on UFOs, and he made a strange statement. They're interesting sightings that aren't reliable, which is true. There are reliable sightings that aren't interesting, which is also true. But there are no interesting and reliable sightings, which is totally false. Largest study ever done showed the more reliable the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable. Carl gives no reference for his opinion. Matter of fact, none of the SETI people give references for their opinions about anything about flying saucers, which is quite amazing. It's not the method of science. Another English astronomer, he thinks that UFOs, those nuts think something crashed in Roswell, and that the method of communication is crop circles. And that's all there is to this whole thing. He said this in London before an august audience and was quoted. The details are in the paper. There's Seth. He's a nice guy, and he admitted publicly on Coast to Coast that he has a copy of my book, Flying Saucers and Science, on his nightstand. Didn't say he read it. We debated. He points out that there can't be a cover-up. I mean, after all, this is the same government that fouled up with FEMA at the Katrina disaster. These are the same guys who operate the post office. How could they keep secrets? Well, how about looking at the CIA and the NSA and the NRO? They keep secrets. The stealth aircraft was built over a period of 10 years at a cost of $10 billion in secret. Why would you talk about FEMA and the post office when you've got the other agencies there? That's not science. So the SETI program will go on, no question about that. Good for job security. I really don't expect them to pick up any useful signals. Who would be sending us a message? Think about that for a minute. Think of how long it would take to get here and what its purpose would be. This is when we were on the Queen Elizabeth II. Like I said, he's a nice guy. That's no excuse for saying stupid things about UFOs. Yeah, here was the discussion about the lack of cover-up. He says he talked to Seth, the Davies. He says Shostak has studied the UFOs seen in detail. That's totally false. Having heard him lecture, debating him on Coast to Coast, I won, incidentally. 57-33-10 for those who are keeping score. That's better than Michael Shermer. It was 80-20 in my favor. He hadn't done any homework. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. There isn't any cover-up of UFO information. I picked this particular one because when I was on Larry King with Bill Nye, the science guy whose purpose is to deny, Seth was on that same program. And Bill Nye shows a document on which one line is blacked out. And he says, these guys are talking about a cover-up. It's privacy. It's the guy's address. Of course it's not in there. I was able, fortunately, I had my book with me, Flying Saucers and Science, and opened to the page and showed this document. I said, this is what we're talking about, a CIA UFO document. By their definition, it took me 5 years to get it, and you can read 8 lousy words. Don't tell me there's no cover-up. My favorite document really is one that says, deny in toto. That's all that's on the page. They couldn't find 8 lousy words to show you. But there is no cover-up. I don't know what world these guys live in. Now here's a very important statement that you won't find in the major media so far as I know. General Carroll Bowler was an Air Force general, an engineer, worked on the lunar excursion module. We landed on the moon successfully in July 1969, some of you may remember. And his first assignment then, so he didn't have to work 12-hour days, was what should we do about Project Blue Book, because the Condon people had suggested it be closed. So he put out a memo, which we didn't see until 10 years later, in which he stated, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system. 2 paragraphs later, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a place to report UFO sightings, but as previously noted, reports which could affect national security would continue to be investigated using the procedures established for that purpose. And he mentioned JNAP, Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication 146 and Air Force Manual 55-11. I located General Bolander, retired. He's dead now, unfortunately. He knew exactly what he was saying. There's a separate channel for reports which could affect national security. Not surprising. Saucer goes down the runway at a SAC base, Strategic Air Command base, where nuclear weapons are stored. That's a national security problem. You and I go outside and watch a UFO go over, a flying saucer go over. Who cares? Happens all the time. No big deal. There are separate channels for reports which could affect national security. I still haven't seen that in the New York Times, Washington Post, any other major publication. It's something we need to remember. Michio Kaku. I've done his radio show a couple times. He was very friendly, and he said one of the few interesting things on that Peter Jennings mockumentary of February 24th, 2005. Well, I use that term because, darn it, I was interviewed for an hour in Roswell, asked good questions. They used 20 seconds. I was lucky. 100 of the 150 people they talked to, they used nothing of. They called me a promoter twice. They had Dr. Jess Marcel on, didn't mention that he was a medical doctor, a pilot, was serving at that time as a colonel in Iraq. Flew 225 combat hours over there. He was brought back in at age 68. You'd think those qualifications would be of some significance in evaluating his testimony. They didn't mention them. At least Michio opened it up. Now, the first program I did with him, he started off by saying, you know, when he was young, he thought excitedly about going to Andromeda. And as he got older, he realized it would take an enormous amount of energy. And I had to say, well, you know, I'm interested in going to Zeta Reticuli, 39 light years away, not Andromeda, 2 million light years away. It's not the same problem, in other words. But I think I have a quote from him. Yeah, on that Larry King show, Real Scientific Approach to the Problem, Dan Aykroyd represented us. And they had 3 astronomers. And I'll give Dan credit. He's a nice man. My wife and I and son and daughter had dinner with him when he was in Fredericton to promote his wine, incidentally. He's a Canadian. He gave a plug for the book Captured on Larry King. Here's what Dr. Kaku said. Life is going to be, I think, found throughout the universe. Amen, I believe. However, I don't think they are going to want to come out and strip mine the Earth. There are a lot of planets out there that are probably uninhabited without restive natives. Now that statement, I say, where does that come from? What do we know about how many planets are out there, inhabited or uninhabited? Nothing. And who talks about strip mining the Earth? Is that why aliens seem to be here? I mean, I'll admit a lot of people went west to dig gold out of California and out of Alaska. My favorite reason, I guess, is that this is a penal colony and they dumped all the bad boys and girls here, and that's why we're so nasty to each other. And when you go to Australia, they take great pride in their convict backgrounds. Honest. So this hypothetical notion, strip mining the earth, none of these guys seem to want to confront something. We represent a threat to the whole darn neighborhood. We are a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare. In World War II, we killed 50 million of our own kind. 50 million. We destroyed 1,700 cities. We know how to make H-bombs. We spend an enormous amount of money on trying to make sure we don't get a surprise attack. Military budget this year will be something like a little over $1 trillion. And it shows you what we care about when 30,000 children die needlessly of preventable disease or starvation every single day. Everybody in his right mind out there would recognize that we're a threat to the neighborhood. 50 million people is a lot of people to kill. So what I'm saying is, among many other reasons for coming here, graduate students doing their thesis research on the development of a primitive society, you can think of a lot of things like that. But I think the biggest thing would be to make sure that we don't go out there. There's Larry. I was hoping to get on his show to tout science was wrong, but I guess he's running out of shows to get onto. I've been on his show 4 times. He has an interest, but I think it's the policy of CNN. You have to have a debunker. Doesn't need to know anything. Just has to be vocal in his attacks on the subject. Requirement. Strange world we live in. And finally, we get to Stephen Hawking. There's no question that he's one of the world's great astrophysicists. And he is also, I know something about handicapped children and stuff, and he also has overcome a very severe handicap, Lou Gehrig disease. And because of him, his comments because of who he is, got an enormous amount of attention, even though they should have been looked at with a raised eyebrow. I have 2 eyebrows that I raise quite frequently. Here's what he said. So if aliens ever visit us, I think the outcome would be very much as when Christopher Columbus first landed in America, which didn't turn out very well for the Native Americans. Now think of that. That means we're like the natives. But the natives didn't have weapons of mass destruction. They didn't have intercontinental ballistic missiles. They didn't have radar. They didn't have spy satellites. They didn't have a long history of destroying the civilizations in the neighborhood. We've had all of those things. And Columbus wasn't that much advanced over the natives. He had big sailing boats, but he had steel. His weapon of mass destruction, the astronomer, the explorers that followed him, was smallpox, which devastated the natives, and that's why small groups of Spaniards and so forth could beat the heck out of the natives, because of smallpox. But at least, Hawking said, there's aliens out there. That's a step in the right direction. Another thing he said, I think we may find primitive life, but it's unlikely there are intelligent aliens within 100 light years, or we would have detected their radio signals. Unlikely. To determine likelihood or unlikelihood of something, you have to have data. You know, you can't figure out what the probability of getting a certain number with a pair of dice unless you know how many sides there are to the dice and what numbers are on those sides, how many pips there are. Otherwise, it's dartboard. Likely that we may find primitive life. In other words, they can't be as advanced as we are. If they were, they would have sent us signals. Hey, Stephen, what's going on down there? I mean, think about that for a minute. We put all our eggs in the radio telescope basket. They don't belong there. My vision is very different from his. These guys never put numbers in. Yes, Frank Drake says 10,000 civilizations, but he doesn't tell you that within 55 light years of here, there are about 2,000 stars. Within about 1,000 light years, there's about 16 million stars. And somehow we're so special. That's a lot of stars to listen to if you think they're going to be transmitting your favorite program. I can't follow the logic here. We don't know whether they are out there. The only evidence we have is what we have from them coming here. And the fact that the government takes the subject very seriously. I mean, they do some wonderful things like figuring out time travel for crash test dummies. None dropped until 6 years after Roswell, but that's the explanation for Roswell. Maybe we could use that to travel out there. Instead of crash test dummies, time travel people. That'll solve the problem. In other words, where's the real world here? Not any of these guys gave any sensible discussion about the UFO evidence. I prefer flying saucer, and some people get mad at me. Why don't you say UFO instead of flying saucer? Because I'm not interested in UFOs. I'm interested in flying saucers. All flying saucers are UFOs. Very few UFOs are flying saucers. All great-grandfathers are men. Not all men are great-grandfathers. You got to watch what you're doing here. Yeah, and here's one of the gems. If advanced life exists, they'll contact us. Aliens haven't contacted us so far. Any evidence for this remarkable statement? How would he know? Does he have a sign on his door? Office of reception of alien signals? Do the SETI people speak for the planet? They think they do. They've got a protocol. If they pick up this magical signal, what they will do in response. Now, I admire Jill Tarter, a very bright woman, big in the SETI community. On the Peter Jennings show, she and her husband are flying their plane, and they see a light. Could it be a UFO? No, it turned out to be the moon. That's the best she could come up with the UFO sightings. But in something she wrote, she said, there's probably a civilization within 1,000 light years of us, and when we make contact, it'll be the greatest thing that ever happened, and they'll help us solve our problems. Hello out there, we got a few difficulties 2,000 years later. What can we do for you? Maybe you can help us with our... Where does this come from? She's too smart to put out that kind of nonsense. But nobody calls them into account for it. And I know there was a letter in the MUFON Journal calling me into account for talking about, referring to them as believers. It's okay for them to call us believers without discussing any evidence whatsoever. But what can we say about them? They're believers in a certain set of assumptions, none of which have any basis in fact. They've done more to stand in the way of serious ufology because they influence the media. Not just Larry King, incidentally, but the Hawking's comments got responses all over the planet. There's Dan. He's a good guy. He's a benefactor as well. good Canadian. Now, another argument made by these people is the Fermi paradox. Lord Rees' quote of the British Astronomer Royal. Now, since Fermi showed that there wasn't anybody coming here, and basically he said that these UFO nuts have no basis to stand on. It's a misrepresentation of what Fermi said. Enrico Fermi was one of the greatest scientists of the past 100 years. Won a Nobel Prize, and then went on to be in charge of the first nuclear chain reaction at the University of Chicago. I was at Chicago. One of the reasons I went to Chicago was because of him. He died while I was there, riddled with cancer. The story goes that at Los Alamos, coming out from lunch one day, they had had a discussion, he and several colleagues, about how it would only take a few million years to colonize the entire galaxy once you got started. And they talked about other things, and as they were leaving, Enrico says, "So where is everybody?" Now, there are whole books that have been written about responses to that question, the Fermi paradox. You see, if it would only take a few million years and the galaxy's been around for billions of years, they should be all over the place. Now, one answer is, oh, they're here, they're leaving us alone for the moment, but the government knows all about them and is concerned about them in one way or another. That's one answer, and there are a whole slew of other answers. He did not say nobody is coming here. He was famous at Chicago for asking questions to teach. Well known for that. The sky is blue determined a certain law of physics, and you can do that. He was a brilliant man. But I hate to see his words being used falsely, especially to show that there's nobody coming here. So where is everybody? This kind of sums it up. I said it before, but I'll say it again. We will spend over $1 trillion this year on military activities. Is it conceivable that we would use our technology for the destruction of beings, of people? Look at our past history. You don't need to look far. Anybody in the neighborhood would recognize that we are a menace to all those more advanced civilizations. The fraction of the budget that goes for SETI is very small. The fraction that goes for destruction is very large. We need to see ourselves as others see us. We may be all very nice people, but our society has got a terrible track record. Shoot first, ask questions later. One of the themes of our society. I think we need to recognize several things. One, the SETI community doesn't speak for the planet. They have their protocols. You think the United States or Russian or Chinese or British government pays any attention to that at all? Why should they? This is the latest book, and on the lower right-hand corner is another picture of that first H-bomb explosion. Science has stood in the way of progress often. The kids up in the middle at the top. Smallpox. There were professional people saying, don't get inoculated against smallpox. It's God's way of controlling the population. We tell a lot of stories of consequences of people listening to smart people saying stupid things. I think it's time we need to grow up. And that we in the field should not sit by passively and let what the world hears about UFOs come from the SETI people or the astrophysics community. They don't know anything about our subject. But they will also insist that there is nothing to know about the subject. There is no evidence. It's been said many times. The duty of a scientist, if he's going to express an opinion, is to do his homework first. And if he can't do that, he should keep his mouth shut. That's one man's opinion anyway. Oh, you want to know about secrets? Top secret magic. Oh, I've got an announcement to make. You can hear it on Coast to Coast on August the 9th. I'll be on with Don Schmidt, who I wish was here. I'd have him up here. And Bryce Zabel, who you heard about yesterday, to announce that there will be a movie called Magic Men, M-A-J-I-C. They bought the rights to my life and Don's life. They own us. And the rights to the book and his book, Witness to Roswell. And it'll be a combination. How's this for a challenge? All the President's Men and JFK all rolled into one. Trials and tribulations of UFO researchers. It's kind of exciting. I hope it comes through. I've had dealings with Hollywood in the past, and let me say that not always do the dreams come true. This is a book in 2008. I'm the Grandpa Moses of the UFO book writing business. The new book is number 5. This is number 4. That was number 3. And Kathleen Marden, my co-author, is Betty Hill's niece, in case you didn't know that. And we have autographed all the books out there, and there's a lot in here that has never been published before. One of the first books about the Roswell incident, second one actually. One of my favorite cartoons. This was in that great newspaper, the Fredericton Daily Gleaner in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And they had 2 articles on their front page, would you believe, about my being named to the Roswell UFO Hall of Fame and my saying that Hawking was wrong. So I took this as a compliment. Some people might not, but I'm taller than that, you know? Thanks for listening. Thank you. Can we take some questions? Or?
Just make sure that they come up to the microphone.
You want me to go over here?
No. Anybody who has a question for you.
Okay. If you have a question, come up to the microphone here. Don't run too fast now. You might trip and fall and you'll sue me.
First. Recently there was an article by Paoli Harris on the Open Mind site that said when Ellen Hynek and Carl Sagan were getting ready to appear on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show in the early 1980s, that backstage Sagan admitted to Hynek that he knew UFOs were real, but he didn't want to lose his funding for his various projects by admitting this publicly. And I wonder how you felt like for people like Shostak or Frank Drake, too, if they're in the position of being brought to science.
And as a matter of fact, I've talked to people at the Center for UFO Studies. I knew Alan Hynek. He never appeared on the Johnny Carson show. As far as we're concerned, it never happened. Now, Carl might have said he's interested in UFOs, but he won't talk about them. He talked to me about them, but it was clear this was a subject that he wasn't making big public noises about, generally speaking. So I think that's a false claim. And I say that having tried to track it down because I called people who would have been well aware of this at the center. Don Schmidt was one of them, as a matter of fact. And he talked to other people and ain't no way. That Carl might have said UFOs are real. What does that mean? Of course they're real. How could you, the Air Force say they've got 12,000 UFO sightings if they weren't real? That's different from saying any of those are alien spacecraft.
Just one other thing. If I think SETI protocols call for, if they were picking up signals from an intelligent source out in the galaxy, that their protocols call for secretly telling the government first and let them make the announcement. Do you think maybe, like with UFOs, they may have picked up signals but just aren't telling us?
I don't think so. Part of that is that if the SETI community would probably do that, but I don't think it makes any sense to say, I don't accuse them, in other words, of conspiring to keep the truth from us. I just think the notion of radio signals from out there is ludicrous. It's a great way to study the universe, don't misunderstand me. Radio telescopes have a place to play in science, but it isn't to find out about aliens.
I'm just curious about this power plant for the UFO. I'm almost finished with a book by a guy by the name Paul Potter in the UK.
Closer to the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Paul Potter. He wrote a book about the engine of a UFO. Well, what he's proposing is that it's a quasi-black hole. Now, China in 2009 produced one in their laboratory. So, I mean, this is a way of getting a generation thing that increases as it goes along, but you evidently can control it in the state they had in the laboratory. So have you done any, you haven't heard anything about this?
No, I haven't. I've heard a lot of strange stuff about UFO propulsion systems. It's something you can get away with, because how's anybody going to prove you're wrong?
No,
hey, call in Zeta Reticulin advisor number 3. Is this the way it works? No, no. We don't know.
No.
There are many more claims than there are truths on our side of the fence as well as on
It
theirs.
was almost 600 pages. He did a lot of scientific papers with, 2 and 2, but I just wondering if you had any
Paul
experience.
Potter? What was the first name?
Paul, P-A-U-L, Paul Potter.
P-O-T-T-E-R.
Yeah, it's the gravitational manipulation of domed craft, a power plant, UFO power plant.
I'll look for it.
Okay. You'll have to do Amazon.com.
Yeah. Where else do you get books besides them? One thing, if you get your books from us, from Kathleen and I, you get an autograph. You don't get that from Amazon.com. You get both our autographs. Yes.
Hi.
It's an honor to be here, and thank you. Do you think that SETI's kind of in the place of Blue Book? Like,
Do I think that SETI is in the place of Blue Book? Absolutely not. To the best of my knowledge, none of the SETI people have done any serious investigation of any UFO sightings. So
Okay.
not in the place of Blue Book. Although, admittedly, Blue Book's primary purpose was to deceive the public into thinking they had everything under control. But the important sightings, as I noted, didn't go to Project Blue Book.
Okay, and then I just think this is a really interesting time. It seems like it's similar to the past when priests or whatever were saying that the Earth is the center of the universe, and they just disregarded the logical information, and it's just really interesting to be a part of that debate. And
Well, I think you're right. And a point I would like, I'm glad you brought that up. From my viewpoint, flying saucers finished the job that Copernicus started out of taking man out of the center of the universe. You all remember Nick, 1543, that was the year he died, his book was published. He had the gall to suggest that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. He only moved it over one little step, to the sun. The book was banned for 300 years.
yeah, it seems like that's what we're still
Yeah, we're still
debating
stuck with
him.
that,
Yeah.
yes, indeed. And so I hope that my great-grandson will grow up in a world that knows that we're not the center of the universe, we're not the big shots we like to think we are. And that's the toughest part about this whole business. The Brookings Institute, 50 years ago, said one of the groups that would be hurt the most by contact with aliens was the scientific community. Their egos are too fragile. You mean there's stuff out there that we don't know? Come on.
Well, thank you.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
If these aliens are advanced, as you say, why would they need worry about us and any capabilities that we have? Much as we have evolved beyond a fly, and if a fly is coming at us, even without any weapons,
Yes.
we can just smack them out of the way. Why would they not just be able to do that and just say, we have no cause to worry about these people. They are not a threat to us at all.
The observations over the past 60 years or so certainly indicate that they've been paying attention to us, and they haven't swatted us. That suggests that maybe that isn't their approach to solving the problem of how to deal with other civilizations. I think that they would be concerned about us because there are rules about how you interfere or don't interfere with other civilizations, and that I think they are more, if you don't learn how to get along with your neighbors, however you define that term, you don't last very long. Somebody's going to clobber you, and somebody's going to clobber them, and it goes on. So you can make the case that if they're coming here, they've learned to get along with their neighbors. But it would be rule number one for any civilization: make sure that the primitives don't take their brand of friendship out here. Much of what we spend on military is reconnaissance, no surprise attacks. Wouldn't you expect aliens would be concerned about us? Look what progress, in quotes, we've made in the last 50 years. It's truly incredible, the rate of change. If I were an alien, I'd worry about the idiots on this planet. Yes?
As long as we are talking about science fiction, and I rather think most of the things that are said by SETI are essentially science fiction premises, one would point out that if one is getting here from anywhere, one is probably going hyperlight. And if so, one is not using sublight communication systems. The fastest way to give a message, if you have hyperlight, is in fact to do it with a ship, not with a message beamed out, unless, of course, you have hyperlight communications, which we do not know how to pick up.
Good
so
point.
I rather think that if we're going to pick up any messages whatsoever, it's going to be ones beamed around inside our solar system by anybody visiting who's using sublight communication when they're not in jump.
I have twice heard stories about guys at classified facilities where a UFO was hanging out close by on their radar, and where their radio receiving apparatus was picking up signals, and the tapes were reeling. Tapes were reeling. And then the security guys come in and grab the tapes and tell them it never happened. What communication? You know, hey, Joe, when do we meet for lunch? From Alien 1 to Alien 2. So it's a point well taken. You're sending me a message. Not by radio. Yeah, I get the message.
I'm sorry. I do apologize. I know there was a couple more questions. We are going to have a speaker panel at the end of the day. We just, two things we do have to keep on schedule, and on top of that, our audio-visual crew, we can only record for a certain amount of time. That's the other fallback. So I do apologize to those who still had questions. Stan, thank you very much for your speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Boy, you're right on the dot.
Right on the dot.
Good for you. Thanks, John.
Yeah, you got it. Thank you. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and take a 15-minute break. Try and be back in here about 10 to 12 minutes. We are going to start right on the dot. We've got a long program that goes all the way to tonight.